United States. And she actually worked as a teacher for 7 years, mathematics teacher. And after teaching high school mathematics for 7 years, she went to the graduate school at Penn State University. And since her graduation for 12 years almost, like 12 years, yeah, she has been a professor at the University of Georgia. And actually, she has been involved in almost like more than 10 NSF grant projects, and she has been working on argumentation and beliefs and identity. And she works with her work generally focused on working with pre-service teachers and also in-service teachers. And she has been a reviewer like for almost, I think, for the top tier journals in mathematics education, like generally journal for research in mathematics education, mathematical thinking and learning, and I cannot count so many of them. So I really would like to welcome her and thank her for being here and giving this speech to us. So my dear friend, AnnaMarie is with us.
Thank you. All right, so I wanted to start out by thanking Isrin for the invitation to be here and all of you for coming this afternoon. I also want to thank the National Science Foundation who funded the projects that I'm going to be talking about today, and the many, many faculty and graduate students who have worked on these projects. These projects, all of them, were collaborations. I have worked with graduate students from the University of Georgia and faculty members from various universities in this work. So I'll give you a quick overview of where I plan to go with the talk. Please feel free to interrupt if you have questions or you would like to know a little bit more about any of these things. I'm going to start off with why I study argumentation, move into the framework that my group developed for teacher support of collective argumentation, then move over to the importance of coding in elementary school mathematics and in elementary school in general, and then talk a bit about some preliminary findings from the collective argumentation and coding project that I'm currently working on. So, why argumentation? Argumentation is an academic skill that is needed in the real world. It's valued by multiple disciplines, not just mathematics, not just science, but people study argumentation in social studies and in lots of disciplines. And really, students need to be able to make arguments in the real world. In mathematics, it's particularly important because it's a precursor to mathematical proof. So being able to make a mathematical argument is necessary for you to be able to prove in mathematics and thus engage in the discipline. Also, several people have studied the importance of argumentation in learning and have found that it fosters learning in authentic and disciplinarily appropriate ways. So students engaging in mathematics through argumentation are actually engaging in mathematics in a way that is at least somewhat resembling that what a mathematician would do. Okay. So, what is an argument? An academic argument involves making a claim and providing reasons. It is not necessarily a debate, and we'll come back to that a little bit later in the presentation. In 1958, Toulmin, a philosopher and mathematician, wrote a book called The Uses of Argument, in which he claimed that the structure of arguments is similar in multiple disciplines. He said that an argument essentially is made up of three main parts: the claim, which is the statement whose truth is being established, the data, which is evidence presented in support of a claim, and the warrant, which is the bridge between the data and the claim. It gives reasons that that particular data is relevant to that particular claim. So the discipline-specific part of an argument really is the backing, which is the discipline-specific reasons that the warrant is valid. So if you want to show differences in argumentation, you're probably going to look at differences in the backings that are being given. However, backings are usually implicit, not stated. And so, for instance, a lot of times in a mathematics classroom, the backing might be because we're working in Euclidean geometry, for instance. And so we're not going to say that every time we make an argument. There's also qualifiers and rebuttals as parts of argumentation, but for our purposes today, we're not going to talk about those. The part of argumentation that I think is really important and relevant to classroom teaching is collective argumentation, which is people, and for our purposes, the teacher and or the students, working together to make claims and to support those claims. In a mathematics classroom, it's people working together to make claims and support them, but the claims, data, and warrants address mathematical ideas, and the teacher's role is very important. That's been established for quite a long time, and it's the teacher's role in all of this that I study in my work. So when we talk about collective mathematical argumentation, I find it to be useful to distinguish who is contributing which parts of an argument. So for instance, when I diagram arguments, claims are blue. Not claims are blue. When the student gives us a part of the argument, it's blue. If the student and the teacher together collaboratively construct something, it's purple. Also, the line style is different. And then if the teacher presents something, I color it red or use a solid line. Things that are initial data like the problem statement or things like that, that are not really contributed by any one person in the classroom, we color green just to distinguish from the other parts that are contributed by one or the other of the people. So in 2014, my research group did quite a bit of work to try to come up with how students might support argumentation. So we said that teachers can support argumentation through direct contributions, claims, data, warrants, rebuttals, qualifiers, and backings. So all of those things that are directly in the diagram. But also, teachers can ask questions and do other supportive actions. So for instance, the questions might be just asking a factual answer, or a teacher might request a method. How did you do that? Or might request an idea, which would be something like asking for a conjecture. Might request elaboration, which might ask the student to provide their reasoning, those sorts of things. Or request evaluation. Think that answer is right? The other supportive actions that a teacher might do include actions that focus the student's attention on particular parts of the argument, for instance. So that might include doing what I'm doing right here, pointing at particular parts of the diagram on the board, for instance. Promoting, those would be actions like, keep on going. I think you're doing good work. Evaluating, I'm not quite sure that's right, or yeah, that seems to be correct. So evaluating. Informing, so sometimes the teacher might need to add additional information in order for students to make progress on a problem, and so those would be informing actions. And repeating actions, and it turns out that repeating actions are really some of the most important actions that a teacher can do. And by repeating, we mean both verbally repeating what a student said, perhaps even adding a little bit to it or rephrasing it in a different way, but also writing things on the board. So if a student makes a claim, we might write that on the board so that that can become the focus of the class discussion. Or the teacher might ask the student to, oh, you said those two angles were congruent. Can you mark those angles as congruent on the board so that everybody can focus on that? All right. So just a real brief example of this. This is a transcript from a class in which the students were examining properties of geometric figures. They were making some conjectures about these. In the process, they had to measure angles by hand, and each group recorded an angle sum on the board. In the small group discussion, the teacher, who's Miss Bell, was inquiring about their results. So this is just a very, very tiny part of this small group discussion. Notice that Ms. Bell asked two questions. One began the discussion in the small group, and the other prompted the student to provide a warrant. So we have, Ms. Bell, what did you figure out? And why do you think that? Are the two questions that she asked. And the first one, what did you figure out, was a request for a conjecture. And the student answered, oh, the interior angle sums are multiples of 180 degrees. Now that was unique because the angle sums on the board were 360, 540, 720, and 897. So there had been some measurement error. And she expected them to give just an inductive argument for why they had come up with that pattern. Instead, the student actually reasoned abductively and said the value of 897 should be 900 because 900 is a multiple of 100 degrees. So she got a bit of a novel argument by asking these questions within the argumentation. Okay, background, we're okay?
What did that show here? That mark, is it abductive? Did you say abductive?
Yes.
So why do you say that?
Because he was saying that this rule, the value, should be 900 based upon an observed, based upon what he thought the rule should be, not based upon the rule that he already knew. Not feelings, but really more saying, okay, no, I was not prepared to talk about the different kinds of reasoning today, sister.
You made it comment.
It was abductive reasoning. But we can talk more about abductive reasoning. Okay, so I'm going to move into the new project that we've been working on, into some territory that's a little less comfortable for me, frankly, because it has to do with cross-disciplinary work, and my work has mostly until now been in mathematics education. So, first of all, why would we ask elementary students to engage in coding? So, we know that the world is changing very quickly. We're preparing students for careers in which they will do things that we have not yet even imagined. However, we are pretty sure that they will need good computer skills and good reasoning skills in order to be successful in these new careers. Coding requires the kinds of reasoning we would like students to learn. Additionally, students make decisions about whether they will pursue STEM careers, and even if they like math, science, engineering, as early as 5th or 6th grade. And many students, including females, decide to limit their work with STEM fields in middle and high school. Additionally, in the US, elementary grades teachers are not usually prepared to teach coding. In fact, many elementary school teachers have never tried to do any coding. Thus, when students encounter coding in elementary school, perhaps in a special class, it's usually taught through trial and error approaches without emphasizing the reasoning that we think is important. And coding is often relegated to after-school programs or maybe enrichment activities, and it's not open to all students. So our premise for this project is that if teachers could understand coding better, and if they could teach students to code using the same methods that they use to teach mathematics and science, then coding, possibly integrated with mathematics and science, could become part of the normal elementary school curriculum, thus not being something that is just enrichment, not being something that people are kept away from. So as a thought experiment, we looked at argumentation in mathematics, science, and engineering, and came up with some simple examples just sort of to figure out if this would work. So these are not important examples, but this is just to illustrate you can, in math, in science, and engineering, those are the three disciplines of people who came together for this project, you can have claims, data, warrants, and even rebuttals. So our project is called Collective Argumentation, Learning and Coding. It's the CALC project. It has nothing to do with calculus. It's focused on increasing elementary teachers' ability and willingness to include coding in everyday instruction. It's centered around a professional development course and coaching and observation in teachers' classrooms. So our two main research questions, which I will not be able to completely answer today, are what are teachers' beliefs about argumentation in mathematics, science, and coding? And how do participants enact lessons based on the CALC approach in their classrooms? So speaking of the CALC approach, it involves essentially these three aspects. We talk about teacher support for argumentation, which we spent a little bit of time on a few minutes ago. We talk about coding content, and we also talk about choosing tasks appropriately, bringing them all together, and positioning them within coding, science, and mathematics content. So last spring semester, we taught a prototype CALC class, and when I say prototype CALC class, and we had an engineering educator, we had a science educator, and myself as a mathematics educator, working together to teach this course. We had 14 teachers who taught grades 3 through 5, and we taught in a format that was 4 face-to-face classes, and the rest of the content was online, because we all know that teachers are busy people. It's hard to get them to attend professional development, and so we thought this might be the best way to do it. We collected quite a bit of data. The data relevant to what I'm going to talk about here is audio recordings of 2 semi-structured interviews with each teacher, and then a case study of implementation that included interviews and recordings of planning meetings, and then video recordings of class sessions that we co-taught with the teacher. So how did we analyze our data? When we analyzed the beliefs, we looked through the data looking for idea units related to math, science, coding, argumentation, and the course. And if a teacher talked about argumentation in mathematics, we double coded that so that we would have evidence of all the times that they talked about these things. We generated some reports, and then we went through and we open coded within each discipline. So we looked at beliefs about mathematics teaching, and we open coded within those, and then did that separately for science, etc. For the case study of implementation, we essentially read the transcripts a number of times to be able to describe the teacher's practice and also her reflections on practice. And we'll talk more about what we mean by reflections on practice in a bit. Our preliminary results really have three foci. First, we were interested in how to revise and modify the course the following year. Because we started out with a course that we weren't quite sure how to do this, and we knew we were going to teach the course again this semester. So part of our results is really, what did we do well and what do we need to change? Also, we wanted to know what additional supports teachers might need as they began to plan and enact lessons in their classrooms. And then we looked for challenges and promises the teachers recognizing in using this approach. So I'm going to go through beliefs about teaching science, teaching math, coding, and argumentation relatively quickly, and just give one or two quotes to illustrate these different findings that we had, even though we have, pages and pages of quotes that support these things. So in the beliefs about teaching science, first of all, the teachers believed that asking questions was central. And in fact, they talked about teaching their students to ask questions. Also, fostering curiosity is important. And for them, that was a little different than just asking questions. And so in science, they were really interested in these questions and in fostering curiosity, and also positioning students at the center of their own learning. So they wanted to let the students figure it out. They wanted them to be able to have evidence to back up their ideas. When we turn to beliefs about teaching mathematics, they talked about the role of the teacher being the coach or the facilitator. And they talked about, some of them, including Bill, talked about, it's not to sit there and tell you everything that you need to know, and sort of parenthetically, that's what I used to do, but it's more to try to guide them into what they needed to do. They also talked a lot about the pressure of statewide testing on teachers that influence their teaching. And the difference here between math and science is that math is a tested subject. Students have to take tests at the end of each year, and the teachers are held accountable for their students' scores on those tests. Science, however, is not a tested subject, so the teachers felt that they had a lot of freedom in their teaching of science. The other thing that came up in beliefs about teaching mathematics that did not come up in beliefs about teaching science is this idea of going back to the basics, needing to learn multiplication facts, needing to learn basics before they can learn the 5th grade curriculum, for instance. So teachers' views, even though these are the same teachers and they're teaching all subjects, their views about teaching mathematics and their views about teaching science were quite different. Their beliefs about coding, first of all, most of them hadn't had much experience with coding to begin with. So they identified needs for more time and more collaboration with others to learn coding. So it's not their background. We're just learning alongside the kids was a lot of what the teacher said about coding. They did say that coding was very important. So this was something that was interesting in that we didn't really need to convince them of this. This was something that they came in thinking. And they also believed that all students could learn to code, and a lot of them that students could learn to code much more quickly than they could as the teachers. So then we look at beliefs about teaching coding with argumentation, because remember, that's what we wanted to be able to do. And the teacher said, essentially, I'd like to have more models to look at. I don't really know what this is supposed to look like. They weren't clear on how to use argumentation in teaching coding. They could articulate, we don't want the trial and error approach, but figuring out what we did want was a little problematic. However, they were convinced that it would help the students if they could figure out how to do this. They didn't want to rely on the trial and error method, and it's important for students to be able to code without doing that. So there was this sort of mix of, well, I know what I should not do. I know what you want me to do. I'm not sure how to get there. So we had these three foci. So we started with, well, how are we going to modify and revise the course for the following year, which is this semester? First, and perhaps obviously, give more examples of teaching coding with argumentation. And at the end, I'm going to talk a little bit about how we decided to do that. We also, given other feedback that was not yet presented, we decided to have more face-to-face time with the teachers. It seemed that that was just really essential for them to learn the basics of coding. And we are rearranging the course to focus on argumentation during the second half of the class after the coding ideas have been established more carefully. As far as additional supports, the teachers essentially said, well, we were pretty sure we could do this if we had some more examples. And the promises that they recognized was that learning coding is very important for elementary students, with the challenge of using argumentation in teaching is more difficult than we or they anticipated. So I want to talk to you a little bit about one of the teachers in the professional development. This teacher is Katie. She had 3 years of teaching experience. She teaches grade 5, all subjects. And we're still working with Katie. This is an ongoing study, so I was just in her classroom the week before I came here. So Katie was excited about the course. She was really enthusiastic about coding. At the beginning, she didn't know much about coding, but she was really enthusiastic about learning about it. And she was really willing to have researchers in her classroom because she thought that would make her teaching better, which was helpful for us. So we did several cycles of teaching in Katie's class, and we're going to talk about 2 of them. So the way this was set up, we had an initial interview in which we just talked with Katie about her views of argumentation, her thoughts about coding, the kinds of topics that were included in her curriculum for that year. And we sort of mapped out a plan for, okay, what do you want to focus on first? Then we got together with her to co-plan a lesson. Her first one, she wanted to just focus on math and argumentation. So she readily admitted that she was not comfortable with using argumentation in math, science, or coding. So she was one of the teachers that came in going, I don't really know what argumentation is or what I should do with it. Okay? So the first lesson was just mathematics and argumentation. After we videotaped that lesson, my research assistants and I chose a couple of episodes from the class, which we came back and we showed to her and asked her to comment on how well she thought the lesson went, whether she saw any arguments in it, those sorts of things. And so then we took that data and analyzed that a little bit. In the meantime, we came back and co-planned the next lesson, which was on social studies and coding, which I will tell you, it's not exactly, in my wheelhouse, but we managed. So we did some social studies, we did some coding, and then we again did an interview with her reflecting on some clips that we showed her from her classroom. So at the beginning of the class, Katie said, I don't really know much about coding right now, which is why I'm in the class. She essentially said, it's the way of the future. I want to incorporate it into my classes. And by the end of the course, she was pretty confident in her ability to code and to teach coding. However, she said about argumentation, I think it could be relevant, but it's not necessary. So her first lesson, she was teaching about multiplication of multi-digit numbers. She felt comfortable with mathematical ideas, but she said, can I do the problems with the kids? And then we talk about it together, a problem with the kids, and then we do it together, and can you be the argumentation lead? So in other words, I had asked her, do you want me to be part of this at all? What do you want me to do? And she essentially said, I need you to do the argumentation. I'll take care of the mathematics. So we did a number of problems, but this is one of them. Carmela has collected 14 boxes of baseball cards. There are 315 cards in each box. She wants to buy enough albums, which each hold 500 cards, to hold all the cards. So the intent was for the students to estimate and then figure out whether they had enough albums to hold the cards. So again, we have the problem, and this is one little piece of the discourse when she had the whole class and they were talking about the problem. Katie said, Larry, you think 9? Why do you think 9? And Larry says, because 9 times 5 equals 45, and then you add the zeros, that would be 4,500. And if you do 8, that would only be for 4,000, and she has 4,310. And another student in the class, Avis, said, oh, I see what I did wrong. Katie says, what did you do wrong? Avis explains what she did wrong. So when we showed her this exchange, now I will say we chose this exchange because we were like, she says she's not good at argumentation, but look at the argument that's in her class, right? So I said when I was interviewing her, what did you notice about this episode? Her immediately thing that she noticed was that she didn't really talk to Larry after he explained, that she just moved right on to Avis. Okay. Do you think there were any arguments going on there? No. Larry had a point, but then no one really else had any other points. Okay, so as the interviewer, I was like, okay, I'm not really sure where to go with this. She says, a one-sided argument. And so she was focused on the logistics of the interactions, just moved right on to Avis. And she interpreted argumentation after this and several other conversations with her. We figured out that she was interpreting argumentation as debate. So in order for there to be an argument, there have to be two people, and they have to have opposing points of view, which is sort of the ordinary interpretation of argumentation. Sort of if your parents are having an argument, they're fighting. And so that she brought that everyday interpretation of argument into what was going on. So this is one of those things that we're working on this semester to hopefully take care of that kind of conception of argument. Let's see what she did then after this in the second lesson. So this one was on social studies, again, and coding. The focus was understanding the experience of immigrants on Ellis Island during the 1800s. And then they were going to use block-based coding to program robots to navigate a map of Ellis Island. Okay. Her analysis of the lesson was that a lot of them got pretty far and figured out how to code it. Some more efficiently than others. So I thought that was great. And kids who might not be excited about normal school were excited about this. So she sees this coding as motivational for the students. When asked if she saw argumentation in this lesson, she said, not a lot when they worked independently, but especially when they worked together with partners, one kid would have an idea to code it a certain way, and the other kid would have an idea to code it another way, and they would talk about that. So again, we're seeing this, you have to have two different points of view for there to be an argument. So later on in the interview, I asked, how are you feeling about implementing coding and argumentation? I love doing the coding part. Argumentation is still, I need practice on it, but I do love the coding part. So still her focus is on coding and argumentation, I think possibly because she sees it as needing to have two different points of view, is sort of on the back burner, sort of a sideline. So some preliminary conclusions. And I do keep saying preliminary because, as I said, this is an ongoing project. the teachers, and it was not just Katie, although Katie happened to be the one that I was working with and brought to you today. They interpreted argumentation as debate rather than a logical series of statements leading to a claim. Teachers also saw coding as motivating for students. They struggled to see that connection between argumentation and coding. Some of them used argumentation pretty readily in their teaching of math and science. Others actually had not a lot of background in that. And their beliefs about math and science teaching were only somewhat aligned with professional recommendations. So, implications for current and future work based upon these conclusions. Viewing argumentation as debate is less helpful in math and coding than in other subject areas. So, to some extent in social studies, viewing argumentation as debate is not too much of a problem, because one of the things that teachers are trying to do in social studies is actually to have students debate ideas. We did change the structure of the course this semester to attempt to challenge this idea more effectively. So students saw coding as motivating for students. On one hand, that's great, because that means that they want to include coding as part of their instruction. But the kinds of codings that they included on several occasions were more coding as a fun activity instead of coding as a learning opportunity. So for our work, we think we need to spend less time convincing teachers of the relevance of coding and more time identifying the appropriate professional development experiences that will allow them to use coding as a learning experience as opposed to just a fun activity. I mean, it can be fun and learning. Looking to see the connection between coding and argumentation. So this is the biggest revision that we've made in the course thus far, and that is we revised the course materials so that we're engaging in teachers in argumentation while coding at the beginning of the course. So actually up until now, we've been teaching since January. Up until now, we have engaged teachers in argumentation explicitly as they've been doing coding activities. But we have not yet talked about argumentation and the kinds of arguments that they're making. That will start actually very soon after I get back. We have another teaching day with the teachers, and we will introduce the construct of argumentation and ask them to reflect on their experiences arguing and making arguments with coding at the beginning in order to hopefully help them to see that connection in their own experience before trying to help their students have that experience. And so I can't tell you how that's working because, well, it's in progress. And the last part, the teacher's beliefs about mathematics and science teaching. Really, there's just still a lot of work to do in changing teachers' beliefs about mathematics as a discipline, about science as a discipline, and about how one can effectively teach those subject areas. So our next steps, we are teaching a second iteration of the course. We have 21 teachers in this iteration. After we teach the course this time, we're planning to revise the materials and make them available for other people to use. And we'll be examining the implementation of the second cohort teachers, their teacher knowledge with respect to coding in particular. And also we'll be looking at, in their classrooms, student learning and motivation and attitudes. So, are there questions and comments?
Right before the last slide, I was about to prepare a question saying that, like, are you planning on scaling the research up and the program? But you have, I guess, a plan for making the materials available for other people to use. But other than that, we have a plan for scaling the curriculum.
We would like to scale the project up. We've been in talks with each other as we're doing the second iteration about perhaps putting in another grant to do this more widely, see if we can find a way to deliver the materials in an online fashion instead of face-to-face as much. Where I'm from, it's not a big city, and so it's a little bit difficult to reach all the teachers in the area in a face-to-face sort of fashion. So we're trying to figure out if we can do that. But since the first iteration of the hybrid model was not as successful, and we're meeting with them more frequently this time, we have a little debate within our team as far as whether that's going to work.
Recently, I saw something on social media. It's about, I don't know, maybe you saw also that, but I'm a developer. I won't teach my kids to code, neither should you. And this is an engineer writing about what is coding and what it is not, and then how it is addressed or so. But then I was just kind of objecting to that article in a sense that he was mentioning about some daily life things that he does with his son and all those events, and I see math skills all over it and in the reasoning. And then, as an engineer, he's trying to give the message that what's important is not an act of coding, like you said about being a fun or learning activity. But when he was trying to give that message, he's misleading in a sense people in a way that coding is bad, don't teach it or so. So when I see your research and what you guys have been done, it's very promising in a sense that it will clear up some misunderstandings about coding, because without proper mathematical skills or reasoning, coding can be just fun. And but then from engineer's perspective, and then he's in the argument, maybe I will share it to you later, but in the argument he's saying that when we are cooking at home, we discuss this, but it was just all reasoning and what you have been talking about, argumentation. So it may clear it up for people who doesn't know much about math education and literature, that when you do coding, there is some backing up in there, and it's part of that is argumentation, and it will be a nice opportunity when you will share those all materials also. But I have a question. That was my comment. I wonder how was it to work with engineers. I work with a science education person and then on STEM education, and I find it very it's a learning opportunity for both of us. But we never work with an engineer, right? And we are thinking about that. But I wonder how it is to work with, you say, engineer educator.
Yes, so there was
Is there a difference between them, and how is it?
So on our team, we have two engineers. We have the person I call the engineering educator. His title is, I think, workforce education, but he's done a lot of teaching teachers who will be teaching the engineering curriculum at in high schools and middle schools. And then a science educator and myself. I developed a relationship with the engineers early on, probably starting in my third year at UGA. We did some professional development with teachers, the core of us that made up this grant project. And I mean, a lot of it has been sort of educating each other. So the engineers are very gung-ho about, like, they need to know the engineering design process, they need to know the math skills, they need to know, and sort of the need to know thing. But the ones that we've been working about have been very good about leaving a lot of the pedagogy to me, because I kind of have the background that they don't have. And in this project, I take the lead on the research end of it. And we have an engineer as the PI who kind of oversees all of the logistics of the project. And that's worked pretty well thus far. And he wants to know more about the kinds of research that we do, and so I'm teaching him how to code the data and things like that, which is a little strange, but yeah. But yeah, I mean, it has worked really well, but I would say one of the reasons that it is working is because we developed relationships in small projects along the way before we started doing this big project. Does that answer your question?
Yes, of course.
Anna,
Yes.
did I miss the content of the in-service or the course? So you said something about all face-to-face, the rest is online, how long, and did they really experience argumentation coding themselves?
So the first time around, I would say yes and no. So we did attempt to teach the coding through argumentation, but it was a little bit difficult because the person who was teaching the coding was really learning what we meant by argumentation sort of at the same time. So that was a little bit difficult. Essentially, we went through and did different coding ideas like control structures and things like that. And we also learned different languages. It was all block-based, but different robots use different sort of configurations of, mostly based on Scratch programming. So they learned some Scratch programming. They learned Ozo-Blockly, which is a particular kind of robots. They learned to program in Logic, which is for robo robots. So they learned sort of all of that content around robotics and programming. And we did some lessons that were about argumentation in math and science and talking about scientific inquiry and things like that. And then we did talk about and explicitly asked them to identify arguments that they made when they were engaging in coding. But there was a lot of logistics that went wrong in that first class that I didn't really talk about. And so I would say some of them kind of got the idea, and a lot of them left going, well, I can kind of program robots a little better now. Does that answer your question? We're trying to do better this semester. Yes, exactly. In fact, our engineering friends are writing a paper that has to do with that.
Actually, one related question, engineering educators, you said in middle school, high school, there is engineering classes?
Yes, in some high schools and middle schools in Georgia and in other states too. I had no idea until I came to Georgia that actually was the case, but yes.
I have another question.
Yes.
The program is developed within the university, but is it something that the district was asking for you to do it? So it was like a need, it was just coming from them.
Yes.
Because otherwise, like it's that you do the things with them, even though they are participating voluntarily, it is not that reflected on the whole school.
Correct. So this district, we've been working with this district. When I say we, a couple of the engineers and I have been working with this district for, well, they've been working with the district for probably 10 or 12 years. For me, maybe 8 or 10 years. Doing various STEM kinds of things, trying to increase content knowledge and things like that. And about 5 years ago, they decided in the district that they really wanted to start including robotics as part of their curriculum. And so there's been a pretty big push for them to have robotics available to teachers in schools, even though each teacher might not have their own robots. But there have been robots available to them in different ways in different schools in the district. And they asked if we would find a way to really, we had a small project before this one where we worked with different teachers on some programming and robotics. And so this is sort of the culmination of quite a few years of work with the district. And the teachers in the district are excited about it, which is very helpful. I don't like doing professional development if the teachers have not bought in and think that it's a good idea.
How is it like, would you say that this is something for program that is video based? Because you mentioned that you showed some of the videos to the teachers for them to realize that what's going on there. So, or is it just a supplementary aspect?
So for the research, I would say the design is the same that I've had in other projects, which is we plan with the teachers, then the teachers teach, and sometimes we co-teach with the teachers, and we videotape that, and then my research assistants and I look at it and find episodes of argumentation or episodes that could have been argumentation, and transcribe them, and then we give the transcripts to the teacher and show the videos in a interview setting, and ask the teachers to react to what they're seeing in their own practice. So I think the video is integral to that part of it, and I think it's also really helpful for teacher learning. Did you have
Maybe similar. I'm asking myself if I understand it correctly. What is the real reason why we want to put argumentation into this? And my answer would be because we want the teachers to analyze the quality of the arguments that I'm going on. But when I think of coding, maybe it's because I'm an old person, and when I was a student, we used to learn programming. We used to call that programming, and the kind of, when I think of the kind of reasoning involved there, well, how important is argumentation for programming something? Because if one thinks about the quality of the arguments one is making when coding, that would slow one down. It could be only useful for teachers if the students cannot do coding because their arguments are bad. So how would you?
Yeah. I think, first of all, when I learned to do coding, it was called prompt programming as well. So the coding that elementary school students are doing these days is very block-based. So there's not as much worry about syntax and did you put that semicolon in exactly the right place or leave it out so that your code doesn't run. The kinds of things that we're asking them to do are usually somewhat related to mathematics or science or that sort of thing, in that, like, can you make your robot walk in a square? Well, if I want to make my robot walk in a square, there are multiple ways that I could do it, right? I could tell it to walk forward and then turn, walk forward and then turn. Or I could say, repeat this 4 times, walk forward and turn, walk forward and turn. Or walk forward and turn, and then I'm done. And we can have an argument about which one of those is more efficient. And students could argue either way, actually, in that particular circumstance. But then, you know, when you say, okay, but let's say we wanted to make a whole checkerboard of squares, well, then perhaps efficiency becomes more important. And we can have arguments that have to do with efficiency of programming and the number of steps that it takes to actually achieve whatever purpose we had in that programming assignment, things like that. So we're not talking so much about, can you make an argument that this program will run? It's more about, is this a good way to do it? Does that answer your question?
We have any questions? Comments? So I'd like to thank our guests just for doing this really nice, speech. And I'm gonna just give you 2 presents from packet.
Oh,
Yeah, it's not much.
thank you.
Thank you. Don't have to, yeah.